Paralyzed teen wheels into arena. What the wild stallion did next left everyone in tears. No one can tame that one, the trainers declared, watching the restless black stallion shadow. But 16-year-old Emma, from her wheelchair, spoke softly to him. "You're lonely too, aren't you?" The horse stilled, listening. "Emma, get back. He's dangerous," shouted the head trainer, Jack. Ignoring the warning, Emma held her ground. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Shadow stepped out, bowed his head, and gently nuzzled her hand. As tears welled in Emma's eyes and she whispered, "You understand me, don't you?" The wild horse incredibly knelt before her. "Oh my God," Jack breathed in disbelief. "Is he kneeling?" Don't miss the full heart-stopping story of Emma and Shadow and the moment that brought everyone to tears. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and listen now. The dust in the main arena hung thick and golden in the late afternoon sun, each particle a tiny spotlight in the heavy silence. 16-year-old Leo gripped the joystick of his wheelchair, his knuckles white. Opposite him, the stallion known only as Rogue was a vision of contained fury, jet black, with eyes like burning coal. The horse was a recent violent arrival at the Last Chance Sanctuary, a creature whispered to be untamable, broken beyond repair. Two experienced handlers, their faces grim, stood near the reinforced gate, poles in hand, ready but reluctant. Leo had been warned, his mother had pleaded, his therapist had gently questioned his motives. But here he was. Rogue had been circling, a restless storm of muscle and distrust. Now he stopped. His head, previously low and snaking with suspicion, shot up, ears pricked forward, not in curiosity but in a sharp, aggressive focus, fixed entirely on the boy in the gleaming metal chair. A tremor ran through the stallion's powerful shoulders. He pawed the earth once, twice, sending clods of dirt flying. A low, guttural growl, more canine than equine, rumbled from his chest. One of the handlers, a weathered man named Sal, muttered, "Leo, maybe we call it, he's too wound." Leo didn't answer, his gaze locked with Rogue's. He could feel the thrum of the horse's agitation in his own chest, a familiar echo of the chaos that had once consumed his own life. Then Rogue moved, not a circle this time, but a direct, explosive lunge. Dust erupted from his hooves as he covered half the distance to Leo in 3 terrifying strides. There was no warning, no feint, just raw, unadulterated power aimed straight at the most vulnerable figure in the arena. A collective gasp sucked the air from the onlookers huddled by the fence. A small group of sanctuary staff, a local vet, and Leo's own pale-faced mother. Someone screamed, a short, choked sound. Sal and the other handler surged forward, poles raised, shouting Rogue's name. But they were too far, too slow. Rogue was a black thunderbolt, descending. Leo didn't flinch, didn't try to turn, he just watched. His heart a wild drum against his ribs as the massive horse, nostrils flared, teeth bared in what looked like a primal snarl, bore down on him. The world narrowed to the terrifying beauty of the approaching stallion, the scent of horse and fear, and the deafening roar of his own blood in his ears. This was it, the end of a very short, very fragile hope. Just 18 months ago, Leo Maxwell had been the star quarterback of his high school football team, his future bright with the promise of scholarships and a life defined by motion. He'd lived for the roar of the crowd, the satisfying thud of a well-thrown spiral caught in the end zone. the easy camaraderie of his teammates. Horses had been a peripheral part of his life then. His younger sister rode, and he'd occasionally tagged along to her stables, admiring their power from a safe distance, but never feeling a particular pull. His world was the gridiron, his legs the powerful engines that drove his dreams. Then came the highway, a slick patch of unexpected black ice on a winter's night, and the sickening crunch of metal. He'd woken up in a sterile white room to a silence more terrifying than any sound. The lower half of his body, an unresponsive void. Paraplegic. The word had slammed into him with the force of a linebacker, shattering his world, his identity, his future. The months that followed were a blur of pain, grueling physiotherapy, and a deepening, corrosive bitterness. The boy who had once commanded a field now struggled to navigate a doorway. The easy confidence was replaced by a simmering anger, a profound sense of injustice. He pushed everyone away, his grieving parents, his concerned sister, his old friends who didn't know how to talk to him anymore. He was trapped not just in the chair, but in a prison of his own despair. The Last Chance Sanctuary, a sprawling, rugged facility on the outskirts of their Montana town, was his mother's desperate idea. It specialized in rehabilitating horses that others had given up on, animals seized from abusive situations, wild mustangs deemed too dangerous for adoption, thoroughbreds broken by the track, run by Martha Marty Caldwell, a woman whose face was a roadmap of hard years and quiet compassion. The sanctuary was a place of raw honesty, where broken things, both equine and human, Marty often said, were given a chance to mend, or at least find peace. Leo had resisted, fiercely. What could he, a cripple, possibly offer a bunch of damaged horses? What could they offer him but another reminder of all he'd lost? But his mother, in a rare show of unyielding resolve, had insisted, "Just try, Leo, for me, for yourself." Rogue was the sanctuary's most recent and by far most challenging acquisition, a magnificent black Mustang stallion. He'd been captured from a remote range after a brutal roundup that had scattered his herd. He bore the scars of ropes and rough handling, both physical and psychological, for weeks. He'd been a whirlwind of terror and aggression in his isolated pen, kicking out at anyone who came near, his eyes blazing with a wildness that seemed untamable. Several experienced trainers had declared him a lost cause. The inciting incident wasn't a single, dramatic moment, but a slow, dawning realization within Leo. During his first few reluctant visits to the sanctuary, forced there by his mother, he'd found himself drawn, despite himself, to the furious energy of the black stallion. He'd sit by Rogue's pen, ostensibly reading or ignoring everyone, but he'd watch the horse. He saw not just the aggression, but the profound fear beneath it, the desperate thrashing of a creature utterly out of its depth, much like himself. One afternoon, Marty found him there. "He's a mirror, isn't he?" she'd said, not unkindly, full of rage because he's scared and doesn't know how to be anything else right now. She then issued a quiet challenge, or perhaps an invitation. "We're running out of options for him, Leo. Most think he's too dangerous, but I see something in his eyes, and sometimes it takes someone who understands being trapped to reach someone else who feels the same." Leo had scoffed, but the words had taken root. His initial unspoken goal had been simply to endure these visits. Now, A new, terrifying, yet undeniably compelling thought began to form. What if he could reach this horse? What if, in trying to save Rogue, he could find some piece of himself he thought was gone forever? It was this fragile, half-formed hope that led him, against all advice, to agree to that first session in the main arena, a session that had just culminated in what looked like an imminent, disastrous attack. The attack was, in fact, a devastatingly abrupt halt. Rogue skidded to a stop a mere 3 feet from Leo's wheelchair, his massive chest heaving, nostrils flaring wide as he sucked in ragged breaths. Dust swirled around them. For a long, breathless moment, horse and boy were frozen, locked in a silent standoff. The handlers, Sal and a younger man named Ben, were still halfway there, poles lowered in stunned disbelief. Leo's mother let out a sob, a mixture of terror and relief. Rogue didn't charge again. Instead, he snorted, a sound like a deflating bellows, and shook his magnificent head, his wild eyes still fixed on Leo, but the inferno in them had banked, replaced by an intense, unnerving scrutiny. He was processing the stationary, unafraid figure in the strange metal contraption. Leo, his heart still hammering, found his voice, a surprisingly steady whisper. "Hey there, big guy." This was the true beginning of their journey, a path fraught with suspicion, fear, and the monumental challenge of bridging the chasm between a paralyzed teenager and a deeply traumatized wild stallion. Marty Caldwell, despite the initial scare, allowed the sessions to continue, albeit with stricter safety protocols, and Sal always present just outside the round pen they moved to, smaller, more controlled, less intimidating for Rogue. The initial sessions were a delicate dance of advance and retreat. Rogue remained highly reactive. A sudden movement from Leo's chair, a glint of sunlight off the metal, the arrival of another person near the pen, any could send him into a fit of agitated pacing, tail lashing, ears pinned. He'd kick the wooden panels of the pen, a sharp, percussive protest that made Leo jump, even though he knew he was relatively safe. Leo's primary complication was his physical limitation. He couldn't use traditional methods of horsemanship, no leg cues, no subtle shifts in seat, no ability to quickly move out of harm's way if Rogue truly spooked. He had only his voice, his stillness, and the unwavering empathy that grew with each session. He learned to read Rogue's subtlest signals, the flick of an ear, the tightening of a muscle in his jaw, the dilation of his pupils. He spoke constantly, a low, soothing monologue, not asking for anything, just sharing the space, sharing his thoughts, his frustrations, his faint, rekindling hopes. Another complication was the skepticism of others. While Marty was supportive, Sal, despite his professionalism, remained wary. "He's wild, Leo," Sal would say, his brow furrowed. "Truly wild, not just green broke. You can't ever fully trust that." Leo's father, though less vocal than his mother, also expressed concerns, worried that this intense focus was a distraction from real rehabilitation, or worse, a setup for another devastating emotional blow. Rogue's backstory, pieced together from BLM reports and Marty's contacts, revealed a deep well of trauma. His herd had been in a particularly remote, rugged area, and the roundup had been notoriously difficult, involving helicopters driving the terrified animals for miles over treacherous terrain. Rogue, then a younger stallion, had reportedly fought the capture fiercely, witnessing older members of his band fall or be injured. He'd been roped hard, dragged, and confined in a series of chaotic holding pens before arriving at Last Chance. His spirit seemingly shattered, his trust in humans non-existent, yet amidst the tension, tiny breakthroughs began to emerge. Fragile green shoots in a barren landscape. One sweltering afternoon, after nearly an hour of Rogue restlessly pacing, Leo, feeling drowsy himself, simply closed his eyes and began to hum an old, half-remembered lullaby his grandmother used to sing. Rogue stopped pacing. His ears swiveled towards Leo. He took a hesitant step, then another, until he stood near the fence panel closest to Leo's chair. His head lowered slightly, listening. He didn't approach, but he didn't retreat. He just stood, a statue of black granite, as Leo hummed another time. Leo, frustrated by his inability to offer a physical comfort, had been idly rolling a small, soft rubber ball he used for hand exercises on his wheelchair tray. It slipped and fell to the ground near his wheel. Rogue, who had been watching him with his usual intensity, snorted, took a step, and nudged the ball with his nose, pushing it closer to the chair. Leo had stared, astonished. It was a fleeting moment, quickly gone as Rogue shied back. But it was something, a spark. The stakes were subtly rising. Marty confessed to Leo that the sanctuary was facing funding cuts. Holding a horse as unmanageable as Rogue long-term was becoming increasingly difficult to justify to her board, especially when there were other, more adoptable horses needing resources. An unspoken deadline began to loom. If Rogue couldn't show significant progress, his future was grim, likely a transfer to a permanent holding facility with minimal human contact. A desolate existence for such an intelligent, spirited animal. Leo felt the pressure mount, not just for himself, but for the magnificent broken creature who was, in some inexplicable way, becoming his lifeline. The fragile truce between Leo and Rogue shattered on a crisp October morning. A sudden, unexpected backfire from a truck on the distant highway reverberated through the sanctuary like a gunshot. In the round pen, Rogue, who had been tentatively taking a piece of carrot from Leo's outstretched, trembling hand, exploded. It wasn't mere spooking, it was a full-blown, terrifying relapse into primal fear. He reared, his powerful forelegs churning the air, his eyes rolling white. He slammed against the far side of the pen, the timbers groaning under the impact, then spun and bolted, a black streak of panic. He wasn't seeing Leo or the pen or anything familiar. He was back in the chaos of the roundup, hunted and terrified. He crashed into the panels again and again, heedless of injury, a desperate, trapped animal seeking an escape that didn't exist. Leo, his heart leaping into his throat, could only watch, helpless. Sal, who was just outside, yelled Rogue's name, trying to break through the terror, but the stallion was beyond reach. Then, in a blind scramble, Rogue slipped on a patch of damp earth. His legs going out from under him, he went down hard, a tangle of flailing limbs, letting out a raw, pain-filled scream that tore at Leo's soul. For a horrifying moment, Leo thought Rogue had broken a leg, that this was the end. Rogue struggled back to his feet, mud-caked and trembling violently, a long, shallow gash bleeding freely on his shoulder where he'd scraped against a splintered rail. He stood splay-legged, head hanging, his breath rasping. The fight, the fear, had momentarily drained him, leaving behind a creature utterly desolate. Marty arrived, her face etched with concern. Sal managed to coax Rogue into a corner, speaking in low, steady tones. The vet was called. The pronouncement was a severe shoulder strain, multiple contusions, and a state of extreme psychological distress. "He needs complete quiet. Stall rest for that shoulder," the vet said gravely. "And frankly, Marty, I don't know if putting him back in any kind of training environment is wise. He's a loaded cannon." This was the nadir. Everyone, including a devastated Leo, felt it. The progress they'd made seemed to have evaporated. Sal looked at Leo with pity. Marty, for the first time, looked truly discouraged. The unspoken consensus was clear: Rogue was too volatile, too damaged. The experiment had failed. Leo went home that day feeling a crushing weight of despair he hadn't experienced since the early days after his accident. He had failed Rogue. He had let himself hope, and that hope had been pulverized. He replayed the scene over and over: Rogue's blind terror, his fall, his pain. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the familiar shadows on his ceiling, something shifted. Rogue's terror hadn't just been random panic. It had been specific, a reaction to a sound that mimicked gunfire or the roar of helicopter blades. And in that terror, Leo saw not a monster, but a victim, a fellow survivor of a catastrophic event that had irrevocably altered their life. Leo, knew what it was like to be trapped in a body that wouldn't obey, to be consumed by a fear that made rational thought impossible. He knew the echoes of trauma. A new resolve hardened within him. He wouldn't give up on Rogue. He couldn't. He was perhaps the only person who truly understood the depth of that fear. He realized he hadn't been just trying to train Rogue. He'd been trying to connect with him on a level deeper than commands and compliance. The conventional methods, even his gentle variations, weren't enough. He needed something more. The next morning, Leo went to Marty. His voice, though quiet, held a new conviction. "I want to try again, Marty, but differently. No round pen, not yet. No expectations, just presence." He explained his idea. He wanted to simply sit in his wheelchair in Rogue's large recovery paddock. A safer, more open space once Rogue was mobile enough, for hours if needed. No attempts to approach, no food offered, no talking unless Rogue initiated. Just being there, a calm, non-threatening presence, allowing Rogue to dictate any interaction, however small. Marty looked at him, saw the change in his eyes, the quiet determination that had replaced yesterday's despair. She saw a young man who was no longer just reacting to his circumstances, but actively seeking to shape them, for himself and for another. It was a huge risk, but then Last Chance Sanctuary was built on taking such risks. "All right, Leo," she said slowly, "one last chance for both of you." The point of no return. Leo knew this was it. He had to find a way to reach the soul of the horse, or they would both remain lost. The first few days of Leo's new approach were an exercise in profound patience. Rogue, his shoulder still tender but healing, was moved to a spacious, grassy paddock with sturdy, high fencing. Leo would position his wheelchair just inside the gate, near a large water trough, and simply sit for hours. He'd read, sometimes sketch, often just watch the clouds, acutely aware of every movement, every breath the stallion took at the far end of the enclosure. Rogue initially ignored him, or so it seemed. He'd graze with his back to Leo, or stand under the shade of the lone cottonwood tree, a distant, brooding silhouette. But Leo noticed the subtle shifts, the occasional flick of an ear in his direction, the way Rogue, when he thought Leo wasn't looking, would pause his grazing and stare, his dark eyes unreadable. Leo never pushed. He brought no treats. He kept his voice to a minimum, speaking only if Rogue happened to wander closer, and even then, just a soft greeting, a gentle murmur. He focused on his own breathing, on projecting an aura of calm, of peace. He remembered the lullaby, and sometimes, when the wind was right, he would hum it softly, not for Rogue, but for himself, a way to center his own turbulent emotions. Slowly, glacially, something began to change. After nearly a week, Rogue started to graze a little closer to Leo's side of the paddock. He still kept a wary distance, at least 50 feet, but he no longer exclusively stayed at the furthest point. One afternoon, while Leo was quietly reading, Rogue walked purposefully to the water trough, drank deeply, and then, instead of immediately retreating, he stood there, watching Leo over the rim of the trough for a full 5 minutes before ambling away. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. The pressure from the sanctuary's board, however, hadn't lessened. Marty had managed to buy them some time, but whispers about Rogue's dangerous liability persisted. An influential board member, a rancher named Henderson with old-school ideas about horse management, was due for a site visit in a few weeks. Marty subtly implied that Henderson's opinion could seal Rogue's fate. The unspoken deadline now had a face. Leo felt the weight of it. He was sleeping poorly, his dreams filled with images of Rogue being led into a dark trailer, his own helplessness mirroring the stallion's. He doubled down on his efforts, spending every available moment at the paddock. He started leaving a worn, soft t-shirt of his, one he'd worn for several days, draped over a fence post near where he sat, hoping Rogue might investigate his scent in his absence, a silent offering of familiarity. One blustery afternoon, as storm clouds gathered, Leo found himself feeling particularly raw. His own dark night of the soul had descended. His leg spasms had been bad the night before, a painful reminder of his body's betrayal. He felt small, insignificant against the vastness of the landscape and the enormity of the task he'd set himself. What if I can't do this? What if Rogue is just too broken? What if I'm just fooling myself? He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't immediately notice Rogue approaching, not tentatively this time, but with a slow, deliberate walk, his head slightly lowered, ears soft and forward. He stopped about 10 feet from Leo's chair, a distance that was, for him, incredibly close. He let out a soft nicker, a sound Leo had never heard from him before, a gentle rumble. Leo's breath caught. He remained perfectly still, his heart pounding. Rogue took another step, then another, until his warm breath feathered Leo's cheek. The stallion sniffed at the armrest of the wheelchair, then at Leo's hands, which were resting, trembling slightly, on his lap. He nudged Leo's inert leg with his velvety nose, a touch so light it was barely perceptible. Tears pricked Leo's eyes. This wasn't a demand, not a plea. It felt like curiosity, acceptance, perhaps even a strange equine form of comfort. Rogue stood there for what felt like an eternity, simply sharing Leo's space, his presence a warm, solid reassurance against the rising wind. The storm in Leo's heart began to quiet. This was more than progress. It was a profound connection, forged in silence and patience. He knew then what he had to do. Henderson, the board. Everyone needed to see this, not a show, not a performance, but the quiet truth of the bond that had formed. He spoke to Marty, his voice filled with a new, quiet confidence. He proposed bringing Rogue into the main arena during Henderson's visit, not for a demonstration of training, but simply to allow Rogue to be with him in that larger, more public space, to show the trust that had been so painstakingly built. It was a massive gamble. The arena was where Rogue had first exploded in fear, but Leo believed, with every fiber of his being, that Rogue was ready, that they were ready. The final preparation was simply this, trusting the bond they now shared. The day of Henderson's visit dawned clear and cool. The main arena, usually a place of activity and noise, felt unnervingly quiet. Marty, Sal, a few other staff members, and Mr. Henderson, a tall, stern-faced man whose skepticism was almost palpable, stood by the fence. Leo's mother was there too, her hands clasped tightly, her face a mixture of hope and trepidation. Leo sat in his wheelchair in the center of the arena. He'd asked for no handlers to be inside with him, just Sal near the gate, ready but unobtrusive. He was calm, or at least he projected calm, his inner turmoil carefully masked. This wasn't just about Rogue anymore. It was about proving that even the most broken spirits could find a path to healing. That connection could transcend fear. The gate opened and Rogue was led in, not with a rope, but simply guided by Marty, who then quietly slipped out. The stallion, upon entering the larger, more exposed space, tensed. His head came up, ears swiveling, taking in the silent figures by the fence. He took a few prancing steps, his eyes wide, and let out an anxious snort. Leo saw Henderson's jaw tighten. This was the moment it could all go wrong. Leo didn't speak, didn't move. He just breathed, deep and slow, his gaze soft on the agitated stallion. He remembered the fear in Rogue's eyes that first day, the raw panic. He sent out waves of the calm he'd cultivated during their long hours in the paddock. "It's okay. Rogue, I'm here. You're safe." Rogue circled the arena twice, his pace quickening, his distress evident. The onlookers held their breath. Henderson shifted his weight, looking pointedly at Marty. Then Rogue seemed to spot Leo, truly see him, a still point in the swirling dust of his anxiety. He slowed, his gait becoming less frantic. He stopped, his sides heaving, and looked directly at the boy in the wheelchair. Time seemed to stretch. Rogue took one hesitant step towards Leo, then another. He walked, not with the explosive energy of before, but with a cautious, deliberate grace. He approached Leo's wheelchair, his nostrils twitching as he took in the familiar scent. He lowered his magnificent head, slowly, until it was level with Leo's. He sniffed Leo's outstretched hand, then gently, so gently, nudged his cheek with his soft muzzle, a feathery touch. Leo closed his eyes for a moment, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his own cheek. He reached up slowly, his fingers brushing the velvety softness of Rogue's nose. Rogue didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a long, sighing breath, a sound of profound release. And then the wild horse, the untamable Rogue, did something that shattered the composure of everyone watching. He bent his front knees, one after the other, and slowly, deliberately sank to the ground in a deep bow, his forehead resting for a moment on the earth near Leo's wheels before he settled into a full, submissive kneel, his dark, intelligent eyes fixed on Leo's face with an expression of undeniable trust and affection. A choked sob broke the silence. It was Leo's mother. Marty's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes shining. Even Sal, the stoic handler, was visibly moved, shaking his head in disbelief. Mr. Henderson, the skeptical rancher, stood rigid for a moment, his stern facade cracking, his eyes wide with an emotion that looked suspiciously like awe. The horse, deemed dangerous and beyond hope, was offering a gesture of profound respect and vulnerability to the boy who had refused to give up on him. The question of Rogue's fate, of Leo's journey, was answered not with words, but with an act of such unexpected grace that it brought tears to the eyes of all who witnessed it. The silence that followed Rogue's bow was thick with unspoken emotion. It was broken by Mr. Henderson clearing his throat, a surprisingly rough sound. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice softer than anyone expected. He looked at Marty. "Seems you've got yourself a miracle worker there." "Marty?" "Both of them." In the immediate aftermath, the tension that had gripped the sanctuary for weeks seemed to dissipate like morning mist. Rogue, after a few moments, rose gracefully to his feet at a soft word from Leo and stood calmly by his side, nuzzling his shoulder. The decision about Rogue's future was made without further discussion. He would remain at Last Chance, not as a project, but as a resident, a testament to the sanctuary's mission. Leo's relationship with Rogue, already profound, deepened into an unbreakable bond. He became a regular, almost permanent fixture at the sanctuary, his schoolwork often done in the shade of Rogue's paddock, his parents witnessing the remarkable transformation in their son, the return of his smile, the rekindling of his spirit, became the sanctuary's most ardent supporters. The bitterness that had clung to Leo since his accident began to recede, replaced by a quiet strength and a newfound sense of purpose. He was no longer just the boy in the wheelchair. He was Leo, Rogue's trusted friend. Rogue, too, continued to change. The wildness was still there, a spark in his intelligent eyes, but the fear-driven aggression was gone. He became curious, even playful with Leo, and cautiously tolerant of Marty and Sal. His story, and Leo's, began to spread, a quiet legend in the local community, inspiring donations and volunteers for the sanctuary. The new normal for Leo was a life re-energized. He started exploring adaptive sports, but his true passion remained with the horses. Marty began to teach him more about horse care and behavior, adapting methods he could use from his chair. He found he had an intuitive understanding, not just for Rogue, but for other traumatized animals at the sanctuary. For Rogue, the new normal was peace, security, and the unwavering companionship of the boy who had seen past his scars to the noble spirit within. Months later, on a warm summer evening, Leo sat with Rogue in the now familiar arena. Rogue's head rested gently on his lap, the horse's eyes half closed in contentment. Leo stroked the stallion's dark mane, a feeling of profound gratitude washing over him. They had both been lost, trapped in their own private pain. Together, against all odds, they had found their way back, not to what they were before, but to something new, something stronger, forged in the crucible of shared understanding and an extraordinary tear-jerking act of trust from a wild horse.